Tēnā koutou katoa, haere mai, and welcome everybody. Ko Prashant ingoa, Prashant Kim ingoa. I'm Prashant, Senior Business Development Manager, Financial Services and Public Sector here at Toitū Envirocare. I'm really excited to be your webinar host today, focusing on what businesses in the value chain of climate reporting entities need to know. Super excited that we have 572 registrations for today, and we thank each and every one of you for sharing your time with us. The session is being recorded and will be sent to you in the coming days. We'll be running a live Q&A at the end of this webinar, so please use the Q&A function on your screen to capture all of your questions as we go. And if we run out of time to answer your questions, we will provide answers in written form in the coming days. All right, so you'll see some people joining me on the screen. I'm joined today by three esteemed speakers, two of my colleagues, Walter and Dustin, as well as Simonne Elliot, Senior Sustainability and Environment Advisor from the Port of Auckland. The Port of Auckland have been Toitū Carbon Reduced Certified since 2017 and Toitū Enviromark Diamond Certified since 2018. They are part of climate reporting entity Auckland Council's value chain. Dustin Courage is a sustainability professional and chartered engineer with 20 years experience in infrastructure within the public and private sectors. And he sits in the Toitū Science and Advisory team as a sector lead for finance and the built environment. My other colleague, Walter Poulsen, is a senior account manager for the financial sector clients and holds a master's degree focusing on sustainability and carbon policy. He works alongside a number of Toitū's climate reporting entities, as well as our suppliers, assisting in with annual Toitū carbon program certifications, setting emissions targets, and exploring approaches to value chain measurement. All right, so just a brief introduction of Toitū. Walter. Toitū Envirocare is a subsidiary of Manaki Whenua Landcare Research, New Zealand Crown Research Institute, and we still hold fast to our deep roots in science. For the past 22 years, we've applied that science to enable organizations to take credible climate and environmental action. We are a business, but a purpose-driven one, and that purpose is to help organizations shift their environmental impact from negative to positive. And the organizations we work with every day could range from small SMEs with 10 staff members all the way to large listed corporations with thousands of staff across numerous countries. And thus far, and probably more importantly, we've helped hundreds of companies around the world measure over 200 million tons of emissions, and we've helped them save over 8.4 million tons through the work that we do with them in our programs. We also assist numerous climate reporting entities, about 60 of them. And today's discussion is about enabling the businesses that work with climate reporting entities to gain a better understanding on all things climate-related disclosures in the New Zealand context and how the regime affects those businesses. So today, our experts will explain what the climate-related disclosures are, who climate reporting entities are, and what the reporting requirements of these entities are, and what these entities need from their supply chains. And if you are in the supply chain of these climate reporting entities, what information will you be asked to provide these companies, organizations, and what are the benefits of doing so? So Walter, to kick things off, can you give our audience the overview? What are climate-related disclosures? Who are climate reporting entities?
Sure, thanks, PK. Good, everyone. So in a very brief overview, the whole CRD's purpose is to ensure that the impacts of climate change are actively considered in business and investment decisions. In doing so, the legislation will help aims to help climate reporting entities better demonstrate responsibility and foresight when considering climate issues, lead to more efficient allocation of capital, and smooth the transition to a more sustainable, low emissions economy. It also ensures transparency and standardization around climate risks and opportunities and their financial impacts. So very basically, that's the why. Who? Well, because of their market share and influence, the legislation targets New Zealand's largest listed companies and financial entities. These climate reporting entities have obligations to report on their full emissions footprint, including the emissions up and down their supply chains. This is essentially the carbon emitted from the things that the climate reporting entity buys, and what happens to the products and services that it sells. As for the when, the disclosure regime kicked off last year for climate reporting entities with accounting periods starting on or after the 1st of Jan 2023. By the end of next year, all reporting entities will be achieving mandatory assurance over their full emissions inventory. This kind of legislation is not just occurring in New Zealand. Similar authorities around the world have aligned with the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures, the TCFD, and the International Financial Reporting Standards, the IFRS's, International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, if you're all taking notes. These include the Corporate Sustainability Directive in Europe, the Australian Accounting Standards Board, the Securities and Exchange Commission over in the US, as well as emerging forms of mandated carbon reporting for financial entities in Brazil, Hong Kong, Japan, Singapore, Switzerland, as well as those countries listed on the right there. These regimes all differ slightly from New Zealand's CRD. They've all got slightly different boundaries, they start at different times, but overall the message is that this kind of reporting mandate is spreading pretty rapidly around the world. And here's a map of the countries that are in the process of implementing or are intending to implement TCFD-style mandatory disclosures. To save you from counting, there's about 19 jurisdictions there. And they account for about 60% of global GDP. So there's some pretty clear drivers for climate-related disclosures. They stem from the Paris Agreement, international compliance to agreed emission targets, have put a spotlight on global financial accountability. This is the reporting of sustainability and its financial impacts, as well as the trillions of dollars of capital allocated towards the climate and biodiversity crises. This in turn has led to sustainability commitments by financial institutions, such as those listed in the bottom left there. Supply chain disruptions caused by climate change and trade partner pressure due to changing international trade mechanisms are also pretty big drivers. A good example is the carbon border tariffs coming into the EU. On the importing of carbon-intensive products like concrete and fuel as part of the European Green Deal legislation, which kicks off in 2026. Back to New Zealand, part of the CRD's design is to incorporate a wider scope as possible. Obviously, the legislation mostly impacts the climate reporting entities themselves. These include banks, credit unions, building societies, and insurance companies with assets of over $1 billion. Investment schemes or crown financial institutes with over $1 billion in assets under management, and companies listed on the NZX with a market cap of over 60 million bucks. So these are in effect New Zealand's largest financial companies. Over 60 of these are with Toitū on a carbon certification or verification only program. In terms of what these entities have to actually do, the companies are mandated to include in their external reporting a disclosure that aligns with the 4 pillars of the Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards, which are outlined here. Looking at this and reading through them, it's pretty clear that reporting is as much a strategic exercise in emissions mapping as much as it is a disclosure. Importantly, for companies that provide a product or service to a reporting entity, complying with all 4 of these pillars will result in considerations or impacts on the supply chain of that entity that has to complete their disclosure. For example, looking at the risk management pillar will spotlight any risks or opportunities to the supply chain from the effects of climate change. A few examples on this slide, they include both the physical risks, so for example, damage to property due to extensive flooding like we saw last year, as well as transitional risks and opportunities like changes in consumer preferences due to a business's sustainability practices. Overall, this exercise allows for greater planning and business resilience, which will in turn have an impact on things like insurance premiums, emissions pricing, stranded assets, and reduced overall demand for products and services. Likewise, the metrics and targets pillar, which is currently where Toitū comes in, mandates the reporting of assured emissions data in the CRD. In short, a metric is the measurement of an impact, while a target is what you're actually aiming for. The pillar aims to show the cold, hard numbers. It will reveal how an entity measures and reports its emissions, which ultimately allows for comparison with other entities. Most importantly, metrics and targets inform a reporting entity's transition plan. For many climate reporting entities, Scope 3 or indirect value chain emissions will make up a significant, if not the biggest, share of their carbon inventory. As mandated by the CRD legislation, the climate reporting entity will need to report emissions data for each of their suppliers in their FY25 disclosure. Therefore, suppliers should expect a call from their climate reporting customers very soon to get some emissions data if contact has not been made already.
All right, fantastic. Thanks very much for that overview, Walter. Just a quick, I guess, just a bit of a recap. So we now have the global and New Zealand context, as well as the what, the why, and the who. And we know that these entities are going to need to report on their supply chain very soon. So Dustin, are you able to talk all things value chain with our audience? And I guess specifically the significance of the value chain and what it means to businesses in the value chain of climate reporting entities.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, PK. Kia ora, everyone. So XRB defines the value chain as all activities, resources, and relationships an entity relies on to create its products or services. So you can think of these as upstream and downstream activities of the reporting entity. On the left-hand side, you have things like raw materials and freight to get products to the reporting company. And then on the right-hand side, you have things like the distribution and the use phase of the products from the reporting entity. So an example of this could be a large property developer. Upstream activities would be construction of the property, and then the downstream activities would be the use of the buildings. Also for financial institutions, their financial instruments such as loans and investments would be in that product use phase, so downstream. So let's look at greenhouse gas quantification of the value chain. We can use the greenhouse gas protocol to group emission sources into scopes. The middle scope is scope 1 emissions, and these are the direct emissions from things like fossil fuel use for stationary energy and transportation. So these are quite evident. Then you have scope 2 emissions, which are your electricity use of the operational assets owned by a company. And then you have your scope 3 indirect emissions, which include things upstream like purchased goods and services shown on the left-hand side here, capital goods, the transportation of those goods to the reporting entity, and then downstream on the right-hand side, the transportation of those goods and end of life use of those products and the sold products. Also on the far end there, you can see investments as well. So that is of particular interest to financial institutions. Right, so let's move on and show how a reporting organization is connected to its suppliers. In the middle here, the reporting organization shares emissions from its supplier A and supplier B above and below the reporting organization. So a portion of the direct emissions from supplier A ends up in the reporting organization's indirect emissions, and also some portion of the indirect and direct emissions from the supplier B ends up in the reporting organization's indirect emissions. So we often think of indirect or scope 3 emissions as an iceberg analogy because they are the larger sources of an organization's emissions, and they tend to be less evident and buried sort of below the surface. So really what you can see here is that for the reporting organization, it's going to be essential for them to work with those suppliers to reduce their emissions and create a more resilient, climate resilient business. So let's back up the iceberg analogy with some data. This graph here is from CDP, which is the largest greenhouse gas reporting platform. And on the left-hand vertical axis, you have the various sectors. And these sectors have bars, horizontal bars, which represent the ratio of scope 3 emissions to its scope 1 and 2 emissions. So on average, the black bar is showing that organization scope 3 emissions are about 11 times higher than its scope 1 and 2 emissions. And then it's important to note that CDP have data on financial institutions, and that's shown that those institutions have an average of 700 times higher scope 3 emissions than their direct scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that would be 23 times off this graph. So too large to show here. One other point on this is that CDP have disclosed many companies do not have good data in scope 3 emissions, and indeed many companies are not reporting, the majority of companies are not reporting full scope 3 emissions. And that is where things like the climate-related disclosures are hoping to close those gaps, increase visibility, and with that increase opportunity to reduce emissions in value chains of large organizations. So let's move on to benefits of why you'd want to align with the climate-related disclosures. As Walter mentioned, these disclosures are a strategic exercise, and they're meant to not only be a disclosure of information, but to enhance business resilience, identify risks and opportunities for businesses to mitigate climate risk, but also take advantage of opportunities in this space to build a more resilient and transition their business to a low carbon business model. As touched on in the previous slide, clients are going to have a demand for high quality climate related information, in particular greenhouse gas information. So by getting a good handle of your emissions, you can expect that you could build brand recognition, become preferred suppliers to large organizations. There's also a huge opportunity to reduce your emissions, and with that cost, not only imminent costs, but also future costs from things like tariffs and carbon taxes, etc., that might come in the future. And then one of the key points of these climate-related disclosures is that allocation of capital to a low carbon economy. And so you can expect that by following these frameworks, you can access better capital through climate finance and projects that are aligning with sustainability-linked loans and sustainability-linked bonds. And then that final point there is around insurance companies and the fact that insurance premiums will go up for climate change risks, which will happen. So the better that companies can manage these climate-related risks and show that they are working to reduce those risks, you can expect that your premiums would go down. So the list goes on really for opportunities and benefits. And really the first question organizations want to ask themselves is why they're reporting their greenhouse gas emissions. And you want to identify your intended use and users for your greenhouse gas information. So in this case, we're talking about information to support climate reporting entities, but could also be for other stakeholders. It could also be as a component of your overall sustainability strategy, realizing that mapping your emissions is also going to give you good visibility of other sustainability risks and opportunities. And then there's the various other reasons they're listed, which would be specific to the organization. So let's move on to standards. It's really important when you're measuring your emissions to acknowledge the globally accepted standards for doing this. So you really have your ISO 14064 and your greenhouse gas protocol standards for organizational emissions quantification. And it's really important to use these standards to ensure completeness, consistency, accuracy, relevance, and transparency of your greenhouse gas information. Toitū is accredited by JAS and ZED to certify and verify to ISO 14064, and our program aligns to both of these standards. Also, I just make note that there's a PCAF standard for financial institutions, which is an international standard for accounting for financed emissions. So now that we know we need to follow the standards, let's look at the next couple of steps you might want to do to quantify your emissions. So as we discussed, you're going to want to map your emission sources and sinks. There'll be those evident sources of direct emissions, which you can look to your energy invoices for. And then there's the indirect emission sources from things like your waste and contractors you work with. For those sorts of sources, you could look to your operational expenditures and start mapping your supply chains, look to your asset registers, and engage with stakeholders within your business to uncover all of those emission sources that are below the surface of that, coming back to that iceberg analogy. So let's move on to the basics of quantification. I'm going to keep this really high level. So in essence, when you're measuring your greenhouse gas impact, you've got an emitting activity and then an emissions factor to represent the emissions emitted by that activity. So the activity, we're looking at activity data to describe the quantity of activity you're doing, and then that gets multiplied by the emissions intensity of that activity to give you your greenhouse gas impact. So really you can, for an example of this is vehicle travel. So the activity data for this would be the vehicle's kilometer traveled. And then the intensity would be the emissions per kilometer traveled the vehicle has. So you can think of two levers to reduce your greenhouse gas impact. You've got a behavior change lever to reduce the activity level. So you could reduce your vehicle kilometers traveled by switching to things like public transport or cycling. And then you've got this intensity lever, which is typically around technology improvements. So in this case, it could be switching from the fossil fuel vehicle to an electric vehicle, reducing 80% of your operational emissions. And that also could reduce your impact. So on a simplified level, you got those two levers to play with. And it's really important to understand that as you work your way through different methodologies. Moving on, let's talk a bit about data quality. So again, keeping this really basic and high level, it's important to note that each emission factor has its own set of calculation with various levels of assumption, completeness, and uncertainty within those factors. So we often call this moving up the method hierarchy, and we're always trying to increase completeness and accuracy of our data so that we can get better visibility of the emissions and then therefore be able to work those levers and reduce those emissions over time. So this table is showing a supplier might start with spend-based data, which is on the bottom level of accuracy. These are things like industry averages per dollar spend. So CO2 equivalents per dollar spend on an industry average. These factors will have a lot of uncertainty and embedded assumptions within them, but they're a good starting point. And then you could move up to an average method or sort of a production-based average, and that could be CO2 per ton of product. So coming back to a cement or steel, it could be CO2 equivalent per ton of steel. And within this sort of metric, you're looking to get the most representative emissions factor for your local region. So moving from global emissions factors, you're trying to get ones more regionally specific for within New Zealand to increase accuracy. But the best of all data and the holy grail is really supplier specific greenhouse gas emissions data. So, and that would be verified emissions per unit of product. So if you're a supplier and you have verified emissions per output of product, whatever you're delivering, then that is the absolute best in data quality. And then that's going to enable your clients to work with you to reduce those emissions because you're going to have better visibility of the levers within those factors. Let's move on to science-aligned reductions. The key part of measuring emissions is to reduce emissions. CREs, based on the XRB and disclosure standards, must disclose if their targets are aligned with 1.5 Celsius. And we call those sorts of targets science-aligned targets. So if you are a supplier and you're setting science-aligned targets and proving that your reductions are science-aligned, then you will stand out. There's no doubt that the companies leading in this space are setting science-aligned targets, and not only setting the targets, but also achieving science-aligned reductions. So science-aligned reductions are basically in alignment with the Paris Agreement. It's roughly 42% reduction of emissions between 2020 by 2030. So 10 years to reduce emissions by 42%. And the longer that organizations wait to set those targets and get on that reduction journey, the harder it's going to be. So really the key message with reductions is start your journey of measurement, look for your key areas of influence and significance to start making those reductions now. And there's really no better time to start this transition to a low carbon and resilient economy. And that's it for me. Thank you.
That was excellent. Thanks, Dustin. So as a quick wrap up for everybody, what we've essentially covered today is the trickle-down effect of the CRD regime. Consequently, the demand for high-quality greenhouse gas measurement, management, and reporting is critical to your business to thrive in a world where climate action is now a reality. Climate action requires requires all businesses, big or small, up and down the value chain, to work together. And as Dustin just mentioned, there is really no better time to start than now. And moving on to the next phase of today, it is now my absolute pleasure to welcome Simonne Elliot, Senior Sustainability and Environment Advisor from the Port of Auckland. Simonne has a background in environmental engineering with 12 years experience working for engineering consultancies and local authorities abroad and in Auckland prior to starting at the port. We're super excited to hear from Simonne, who will be sharing some of her experiences with measuring and reporting Port of Auckland's emissions inventory. Thank you for joining us today, Simonne. Over to you.
Kia ora tātou, ko Simonne tōku ingoa. I'm here to talk about the port's experience to date with the CRD requirements and the future of the CRD, about how the future implications of the CRD framework is on our business as well. For my 10 minutes, I thought I'd take a sort of past, present, future approach. I'll touch on our sustainability and emissions reduction journey to date to give you some context, and then focus in on how the port is connected to the CRD reporting requirements and what this means for our future. So on our sustainability journey for our past, we started our emissions accounting and reduction journey in 2017, which is our base year, with the preparation of our first emissions management and reduction plan. We originally committed to being zero emissions by 2040 and have been implementing initiatives to achieve such an ambitious goal ever since, with some wins and some losses. A couple of the more well-known projects include our poster child, our Sparky the electric tug, which is a first for the world. It was proposed in 2016, so it was right at the beginning of our sustainability journey. It has now been in operation since September 22 and is well exceeding our expectations with more work and less energy per charge. Sparky's changing the industry, and the port has hosted visits from about 8 countries to date. And Sparky is recognised as a world-leading innovation by being named on the 2022 Time Best Innovations list and has won multiple sustainability and decarbonisation awards, which we're very proud of. Another project which we embarked on in 2018, we committed to fund the construction of a hydrogen production and refuelling facility at the port, alongside project partners Auckland Council, Auckland Transport and Kiwi Rail, who invested in hydrogen fuel cell vehicles as part of the project. This was a first for New Zealand. In 2021, an on-port hydrogen gateway refueler was commissioned, a small-scale refueling system using tanks of bulk hydrogen gas that is being successfully used to refuel Auckland Transport's hydrogen fuel cell bus. In 2022, a consent was granted for the hydrogen production. However, it was put on hold. The port was aiming to replace its heavy vehicles, machinery and port equipment with hydrogen-powered alternatives. However, this has not been possible to date due to the equipment availability. The project has been successful in the hydrogen space. However, the anticipated usefulness for port was not realised. Our emissions reduction roadmap is now based around battery-operated electrical equipment. So we're now focusing on generating as much solar energy as we can around the port. The first project off the rank will be a solar array on the car handling facility building. For those who are familiar with the port, it's the big rectangular box with the green walls that you can walk past. This array is expected to provide about 6% of our current electricity demand and should be in by mid-2025. So we're pretty excited about that. Thought I'd touch on our sustainability and environment goals at the port. We've got long-term goals and short-term goals. Our first long-term is to improve the health of the Waitemata Harbour. It's restoring the biodiversity of our moana, improving our harbour health. So the objective is to trial and perfect techniques to improve biodiversity and habitat within the port, encouraging sort of beneficial species. We've got a short-term target of one harbour health project for this year, which we've implemented, and it was to attach a detachable rope scaffold called a dream catcher to the side of our pier, to one of our piers, to allow loads of super attractive surface area for organisms to attach and grow. So in essence, we're attempting to turn the port into a marine nursery to benefit the wider area and provide materials that we can then detach and transplant into other areas of the harbour for restoration. We also have waste goals, so zero waste to landfill by 2040. We currently have 17 waste streams that we divert from landfill. There are some pretty tricky waste issues we're having to tackle to get to zero waste by 2040, such as oil contaminated rags from our engineering department and such. We are looking at all and any ways to divert from landfill and have recently repurposed a lot of our marine buoys and safety equipment for art and public sculptures within an initiative with the Auckland Council. We also have the sort of 5% reduction in waste to landfill for our short-term goal, which we seem to be on track for, which we're quite excited about. Then there's the other pillar, which is our zero emissions by 2050. The original target was 2040, but that was based on hydrogen and renewable diesel, and that, as I mentioned before, cannot be realised at this stage due to the equipment availability. Our target is now 2050 to align with Auckland Council's climate plan with the focus on electrification. Our short-term target has been split into two areas. So by 2030, we have a 10% reduction per TEU, which is a 20-ton equivalent unit. So it's essentially one of the smaller containers that you see on our site. And that is per emissions each of those handled. And then we've got a different sort of aspect to our business, which is our marine business unit, which is quite separate to our container handling terminal and associate operations. And we're trying to achieve a 45% reduction in marine emissions by 2030. And because of our Sparky experience, we know that we really can get to that point, which is really positive. Okay, emission reductions, how, I think I touched on this, but basically our board has agreed to replace end-of-life equipment with zero emission options. So that's in our roadmap now. And we've got a lot of kit that needs to be changed out. It's got a 15-year lifetime still. So we also need to look at our interim measures to reduce those emissions until all the equipment is electrified. So these measures will focus on maximising efficient port operations, basically. A few trials with other fuels and such, but yeah, we're just trying to pull that emissions down as much as possible with various approaches. It's good to note that our board has made a decision to invest in the business to reduce emissions rather than offset emissions outside of the business. So we're really focusing in-house. So I wanted to touch on our Toitū sort of journey. So as I mentioned before, we've been measuring our emissions since 2017. And as I think it was previously mentioned, we've been 7 years in the carbon reduce plan. So since the beginning of our journey, we've been audited annually and have maintained our Toitū certification. Under the Toitū carbon reduce certification, our emissions accounting covers our scope 1, our scope 2, and some mandatory scope 3s. We have also included some other scope 3s that we had the actual data for. So we decided to include them in the reporting from the beginning. One that I'll mention at the moment is our third-party operator fuel, water, and electricity, which are kind of like our tenants. They have license to operate at the port, and we essentially on-sell a lot of those services, the fuel, the water, and the electricity. So we were able to get that data, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. But basically, we started out recording all the data we could easily access. And like many companies present here, we now have a very good understanding of our scope 1 and 2 emissions, and are striving to get a clear understanding of the somewhat grey area that is our scope 3s for our sector. There is continually evolving guidance regarding scope 3s since our journey commenced. At the port, we have followed the evolvement quite closely, and over the years have undertaken materiality assessments of our scope 3s based on spend data. But yeah, we're still coming to terms with that. With the gradual maturing of our global understanding around action required to minimise climate change, across the board there is movement afoot, with actions now starting to become underpinned by regulations, which leads us to the present. So as we've heard, the government passed legislation making climate-related disclosures mandatory for some large financial market participants. Auckland Council Group is a listed issuer of debt on the NZX and is subject to the Financial Markets Authority Act. As such, the group is one of these climate reporting entities. The group includes Auckland Council and those entities owned by Auckland Council. That's the CCOs and us, the Port of Auckland. The climate-related disclosure framework is structured around 4 themes of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets, like Walter mentioned before. So for this talk, I'm going to essentially focus on the metrics and targets element, in which our GHG, so greenhouse gas emissions, data resides, as although the climate reporting entity needs to cover off all of those pillars, the component that will filter down to the value chain will be the requirement for better GHG emission data that affects this climate reporting entity's metrics and targets. So financial year 23 was the first year for our group disclosure under the XRB requirements. It wasn't mandatory at this point, and it's sort of a trial run for us. So in this disclosure, all our Auckland Council group entities provided their emissions data separately. For future disclosures, we will need to provide a consolidated emissions data set, where they essentially all get added up together. Now, I just want to clarify this. For the Auckland Council group, each individual entity's scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are included in the Auckland Council group's respective scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So it means we're all part of the climate reporting entity. It's not that, like, each entity will also keep their own emission inventories and certification, but for the purposes of the climate reporting entity, they will all be amalgamated, and the CRE will report on a group inventory. Yeah, just to make sure, we are all part of the CRE, where Port and CCOs are not part of the entity's value chain. However, different entities within the group have different inclusions, particularly for their scope 3s. For example, one entity might have one of the other entities' scope 1 and 2 emissions as part of their scope 3s. So, to be compliant with the disclosure requirements, Auckland Council is currently undertaking an assessment of all the entities' data and identifying an approach to ensure consistency, eliminating double counting or gaps. This will enable a robust, compliant climate disclosure for our first mandatory report for this year, financial year 24. The Auckland Council assessment also includes formulating recommendations for consistent and thorough Scope 3 accounting across our group, which will be implemented in financial year 25. And thus the data included in the, that data will be included in the financial year disclosure of 25. This is where the CRD influence filters down to each entity's value chain. So we would initially have methodologies based on spend data for that value chain, the Scope 3 reporting, but we'd plan to transition to actual data as and when it is available. Thus, the expectations from the XRB of the CREs will filter down to the value chain in the near future. As a little bit of an aside, I just wanted to mention, oh, sorry, I haven't been doing this. Here we go. There's my lovely bullet points anyway. As an aside, I just wanted to mention that the CRD is a regulatory lever that has been pulled to ensure action is happening. However, even without regulations, there are already very proactive actions taking place across New Zealand industry, as we are all aware that the change needs to happen. For example, the other New Zealand ports, including ourselves, regularly meet about environmental and sustainability topics, and are currently looking to identify a consistent approach to Scope 3s for the New Zealand port sector. This would include setting consistent boundaries for shipping, road, rail, best practice methodologies for calculating our Scope 3s, identifying a best practice materiality threshold, and areas where we as a group can support and influence change in our value chain. So moving on to our future. So once we have that consistent approach, the boundaries and methodologies identified, we will be identifying our top Scope 3 emission sources. Under Scope 3, there are emissions within our control and those within our influence. For those we can control, we are looking at using our procurement processes to reduce emissions. For example, we are looking to include contractual requirements for the vendor to provide regular data for inclusion in our Scope 3 emissions accounting, things like fuel and electricity. For waste reductions, we are looking to include contractual requirements to take back the product packaging and the product at the end of its life. We have ongoing conversations with our current vendors to identify if they have sustainability goals aligned to our current emission reduction goals. New vendors will be requested to identify their emissions reduction plans to ensure they are aligned to our emission reduction goals. So we are improving our systems to identify suppliers that are aligned with our goals and direction of travel. As part of the XRB requirements, the Auckland Council Group has also been brainstorming and sharing ideas to enable Scope 3 emission reductions across the group through procurement as well. So there's a lot of discussion happening in that space, I suppose I want to impress. So for those within our influence, we will be identifying where we can best influence and how we can influence. The next steps in the influence space will be approaching our supply chain to request actual data, essentially their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, to refine our Scope 3s. Supplier-specific data is far superior to spend-based factors for calculating emissions. Spend-based is often overestimated and conservative, and it's just so much better to have that supplier-specific data. There are also other benefits for obtaining supplier-specific data that we've found. It can be really helpful for informing our transition plan. I think Dustin touched on it before. For example, I mentioned at the beginning that we have included the fuel, water, and electricity data for our third-party operators on site. So those third-party operators are the likes of Wallace and C3 who function at our port. They've got a license to operate, and they're sort of like tenants, but due to our infrastructure at the port, we on-sell those services, the fuel, water, and electricity. So we've got that data. We've got the really on-point specific data. So what we've been able to do with that data particularly for the fuel consumption, the electricity consumption, we've taken that and it's allowed us to understand their potential future electricity demand at our site. So we've incorporated their future demand into our electrical master plan for the port. And this ensures that we are going to develop electrical infrastructure that is robust enough for future operations for the whole port, and also basically allows them to reduce their emissions as well. So there are some really great initiatives that come out of having that specific data to be able to mine and come up with some really good transition plans for the future. So that's me. I've touched on those other benefits, and yeah, thank you for your time. Really appreciate you listening.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Simonne. I really appreciate that. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions for you and the audience as well. And on that note, we have arrived at our Q&A time. So I can see that we've got quite a few questions asked already, and some questions are still coming through as we speak. Please continue to send in your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. And please note that you can also upvote questions to prioritize them being answered. So our first question of the day, can you please provide some clarity, further clarity about how the estimation and double counting of Scope 3 emissions will work over time to ensure more accurate measurement of actual emissions and thus provide better data and incentives? I'm going to point, I think, both Walter and Dustin, I think you guys could probably tag team this, but let's start with you, Walter.
I could probably waffle on about double counting in terms of, first things first, I think, is to get everyone measuring their emissions anyway, and then we can worry about it. Yeah, Dustin, would you be able to?
Yep. Yeah, so double counting of emissions across the value chain is common. It's expected. There is that overlap in emissions between a reporting organization and its value chain, clearly between what we've just said. But how the amount of emissions that get attributed to the reporting company is done via an attribution factor, and that allocates a portion of the Scope 3 emissions. So it's not all of the Scope 3 emissions of the supplier, but a portion of, depending on the attribution factor and the methodology used. So I think it's important to acknowledge that double counting does happen. It's actually not a bad thing. It's actually the point of organizational greenhouse gas accounting and double counting is that companies work together to reduce those emissions where they have those shared emissions. And that's why they call those indirect emissions sometimes shared emissions through the value chain. So there is double counting. We use attribution factors to give a portion of that, and then it's always important to report which scopes you are reporting on through your suppliers so that you can see where the double counting is happening, and then you can reduce.
Great, awesome, thanks guys. How aligned / different is CRD to the mandatory climate-related financial reporting in Australia?
Yeah, I can take that one as well. So the key thing to note there is that Australia has not finalized its scope, and has not passed. It's a bill currently, so it's not in legislation there yet. There was a really good webinar given by XRB about 2 weeks ago that we can link in the chat, which goes in to this disclosure in Australia, and they are very much looking at a similar framework. All of these disclosures follow the TCFD type framework. A couple of the core differences potentially, again, the Australian's disclosure is not finalized yet, but the Australian disclosures will affect many more companies because they include not only listed companies, but private sector companies, and also public institutions like some councils that meet thresholds. So Australia will have many more reporting entities. They anticipate about 25,000. So it'll include more reporting entities. Also, Australia is aligning to the ISSB standards, which is more prescriptive, and the XRB disclosures are more principles-based. So there's a difference there. But yeah, I encourage people to look at the XRB webinar that they gave the other day showing the differences, and there is way more similarities than differences.
Great. Is it only Scope 1 emissions considered as part of science-aligned targets, or is it about including all Scope 1, 2, and 3?
Yeah,
Walter?
so there's different targets for different scopes.
Okay,
Scope 1 and 2 are included in that 4% reduction year on year, and then some Scope 3s have supplier engagement targets, or you can have, depending on the sector, there's sector guidance for construction sector, for financial institutions emerging, and these are more around aligning your for the financial sector is about aligning your portfolio clients to science-based targets or science-aligned targets as well. So yeah, it covers everything, and they're different depending on the scopes.
Okay, cool. If we're starting off with spend-based emission factors for Scope 3 emissions in the value chain, what is the best source for those emission factors, please?
Yeah, so it involves some digging. I think that there's ways where you can source emissions factors for lots of activities. MFE, for example, have a lot of the metrics themselves. With spend-based ones, I think Toitū has its own database. We'll source them, I feel, from various places as well as calculate them internally.
Yep, they can be calculated internally. Auckland Council did a great report with last year on commodity emission factors that can be used for spend-based. Also, there was a report done by Toitū and GHD WSP on spend-based emissions factors for infrastructure. It was council related, but a lot more of this data is coming to fruition. And some financial institutions are calculating it themselves based on Stats NZ data, GDP, and the output of various industry sectors. So it's broken down. You can break it down by industry classification and basically calculate your own spend-based factors. And that's something that Toitū can also help with. And we do have a database of we're sort of collecting the lead indicators in this space. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. And probably a related question here. Can you please give an example of how you are receiving supplier-specific emissions data and using this in your GHG inventory rather than spend-based data? Who wants to answer that question?
Yeah. I think that would be for Simonne. Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of our supplier stuff, so as I said, I touched on sort of our third-party operators. So we've got that fuel and such. We've got paper consumption. So from Office Max, who we use at present, they provide our consumption data on a quarterly basis for us to include in our Scope 3s. There's a myriad, basically anything that you consume that they can provide you costs, and particularly per item, like per product, then you can incorporate that in.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. To capture organizations' value chains emissions, the spend-based method is at the lower end of data quality scale for service. For a service providing supplier, for example, software technology and membership and subscription-based services, what data is there to capture? How do we ensure that data quality? How can the above be done if the service provider is a small, especially SME in New Zealand?
Ooh, that's a big technical question, which I think Toitū would definitely love to unpack further. But yeah, that's a deep dive one.
Cool.
Unable to answer that straight on the spot.
In terms of spend bases, that it's going through your accounting, looking at GL codes, which inherently just isn't great quality of the data. It's kind of that basis from which we can go forward. It might be the only thing you can get from your SME suppliers. And that's, if that's all we've got to work with and make assumptions around, then that's what we've got to do. But yeah, as I said, that's the basis, and we can improve from there. That's just kind of that first stage.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that is important to acknowledge, is to get started, and you use them as a starting point, and then you start to work your way up that hierarchy.
Cool. Does the CRD require emissions scopes or inventories or inventory disclosures certifications complying with ISO or GHG protocol?
Oh, that's a very good question. So that's a big difference between XRB standard and the proposed Australian one, is that XRB is not nominating a emission standard per se, but a climate reporting entity must disclose what standard they've used, and they acknowledge those international standards of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, ISO 14064, and PCAF. So yeah, it's not mandated which standards you use. And so yeah, definitely seek support and advice on which ones might be best for your business.
Okay, cool. Simonne, one for you here. Does the Port of Auckland include the emissions of external shipping providers in their Scope 3 emissions profile?
So that's a tricky one. Currently, no, is the short answer. Yeah, this is why all the ports are sort of getting together and trying to figure this out, because there's no specific regulations or guidance for us as a port sector. So we have looked internationally, and we've looked at all the papers across, well, globally, and we're also keeping on the pulse of the Australian ports, what they're doing. There's different sort of approaches in terms of setting those boundaries. So whether it be where your pilot gets on and off the ship, or whether it is from the initial location of the ship to you. So that's what we as a port sector are trying to figure out and get a consistent approach across us. But currently, no, we don't have that in our Scope 3s.
All right. It's right on 10:59. There is a question here that asks, will the slides be provided? The answer to that question is yes. And for those unanswered questions, we will do our utmost to give you a written answer as well shortly. Yeah, so we do have to close. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. As you know, our webinar was recorded, and you will all receive a copy in the coming days. For those of you who are keen to learn more from us, please do not hesitate to reach out. We are here to help. And thanks again, everybody, and ka kite.
Ka kite.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.